The gun was already drawn before Rebecca Chandler even finished speaking. She stood in the center of the sheriff's office in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1878, her surveying rod in one hand and a rolled map in the other, and she watched the barrel of Clement Whitfield's revolver rise until it was level with the space between her eyes. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a caged animal. She did not flinch. She had practiced not flinching. "Put that map on the desk," Clement said. His voice was low. It had no emotion in it, which was worse than shouting. Rebecca set the map down very carefully. "And the rod." She set that down too. He walked toward her in 3 slow steps. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone as the canyon walls outside. His eyes were the color of storm clouds gathering over the mesa, gray, restless, full of something dangerous. "You want to tell me," he said, "what a federal land surveyor is doing with a map that shows every private water claim between the Rio Grande and the San Pedro River?" Rebecca said nothing. "Because that is not a surveyor's map," Clement continued. "That is a property seizure map. Someone drew those red marks on there before you ever arrived in this county." The silence between them stretched like a rope going taut. "And the thing that bothers me most," he said, and he finally lowered the gun, not because he trusted her, but because he had decided he wanted her to see his eyes when he said the next words, "is that I have known for 6 days that you were not what you claimed to be." And I said nothing. The weight of that admission landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Rebecca Chandler felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She had ridden into Dusty Creek on a Monday morning 6 days before, arriving on the stage from Santa Fe with a leather satchel, a surveying rod, a brass transit theodolite that had cost her more than she cared to admit, and a letter of introduction bearing the stamp of the General Land Office in Washington, D.C. The letter was real. The stamp was real. The authorization to survey newly partitioned land tracts in Socorro County was entirely real. What was not real was the name on the letter. Or rather, what was not entirely real was what she intended to do with the survey. The stage had pulled into Dusty Creek just after 9 in the morning, and the town had announced itself to her in the way that small western towns always did, with dust and noise, and the smell of horses, and the sound of a hammer striking iron from the direction of the smithy. Dusty Creek was not large. It had a main street about 300 yards long, a general store, a saloon called the Red Meridian, a telegraph office, a church that was also used as a schoolhouse, a livery stable, a doctor's office, and the sheriff's office, which was a squat adobe building with a red wooden sign above the door. She had climbed down from the stage before the driver had even fully set the brake and stood in the street brushing red dust from her traveling coat. She was 27 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned severely beneath a wide-brimmed canvas hat she had purchased in Albuquerque. She was not beautiful in the conventional way that the frontier valued beauty. She was not soft or delicate or easily impressed. She was sharp-featured and direct, with green eyes that missed nothing and hands that were calloused from months of field work in the New Mexico sun. 3 men on the boardwalk outside the general store had stopped their conversation when she stepped off the stage. She had ignored them completely and walked directly to the sheriff's office. Clement Whitfield had been sitting behind his desk eating a breakfast of salt pork and cornbread when she walked in. He was 34 years old. He had served as sheriff of this county for 4 years, having come to it after a decade in the Texas Rangers that he did not speak about except in the vaguest terms. He was not the kind of man who was easily surprised by anything, but he had looked up from his plate when the door opened and there she was, and something in his expression had shifted almost imperceptibly. He had stood up. The chair scraped back. He wiped his hand on a cloth. She had introduced herself. She had produced the letter from the General Land Office. She had explained that she was here to conduct a cadastral survey of the newly partitioned land tracts along the Chandler Creek watershed, and then she had stopped because she realized what she had just said, and a faint color had come into her cheeks that she absolutely could not afford. She had said Chandler Creek, her own name, spoken without thinking. Clement Whitfield had looked at her for exactly one long second. He had taken the letter from her hand, read it carefully, folded it, and handed it back. "The survey posts are already set from the original 1874 survey," he said. "You'll want to check them against the new territorial lines. I can have my deputy ride out with you tomorrow morning as a guide." That was all he had said. He had not pointed out that surveyors from the General Land Office rarely traveled alone without a survey crew. He had not pointed out that she had said a creek name that matched her own surname before correcting herself. He had not pointed out that the letter, while real, bore a registration number he had seen before on a different set of documents that had come through his office 8 months ago under very different circumstances. He had said none of that. He had assigned her a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Aldecoa, and he had watched from the window as Rebecca Chandler walked down the main street with her satchel and her transit and her long, deliberate stride, and he had felt the particular and complicated feeling that comes from recognizing someone who is carrying a secret and choosing, for reasons you cannot yet entirely explain to yourself, not to call them on it. His deputy's name was Tom Hargrove. Tom was 22 and enthusiastic and talked constantly, which was a quality that Rebecca had found deeply exhausting for the first 2 days in the field and deeply useful by the third, because Tom knew everyone in the county and had no instinct for keeping what he knew to himself. She had learned, through Tom's cheerful and unguarded conversation, that the major landowners along the Chandler Creek watershed were a rancher named Douglas Pierce, who held grazing rights to some 40,000 acres under a Spanish land grant that predated the territorial government by a century, and a mining concern called the Southwest Consolidated Land and Resources Company, which had been quietly buying up water claims for the past 3 years. She had also learned, more slowly, through the careful piecing together of what Tom said and what he did not say, that Clement Whitfield had been investigating the Southwest Consolidated Land and Resources Company for at least 8 of those months, and that the company's primary legal counsel in Santa Fe had recently filed a complaint with the territorial governor's office, alleging that the sheriff of Socorro County was conducting an unauthorized harassment campaign against a legitimate business enterprise. That had been interesting information. She had sat with it in her room at Mrs. Aldecoa's boarding house on the 3rd evening, her map spread across the bed, a kerosene lamp burning low, and she had thought carefully about Clement Whitfield and what he knew and what he suspected and what she was going to do next. Because here was the thing about Rebecca Chandler and the survey she was conducting. It was real. She was genuinely a surveyor. She had studied under a licensed government surveyor in Denver for 3 years after coming west from Philadelphia following the death of her mother, and she had an eye for land measurement that her teacher had called better than most men he had known with 20 years of experience. The General Land Office letter was genuine, and the survey work she was doing along the creek was accurate and thorough. But she had come to Dusty Creek for a reason that had nothing to do with official business, and the red marks on the map that Clement Whitfield had identified were not the product of anything she had drawn. They were pre-existing marks on a document she had been given in Santa Fe, not by the land office, but by a lawyer named Howard Fisk, who represented the interests of several small landholders along the watershed, men and women who had been slowly and systematically bought out, pressured out, or legally maneuvered out of their water rights by the Southwest Consolidated Land and Resources Company. Howard Fisk had believed that a thorough, independent survey of the actual physical water distribution along the creek would reveal that the company's claimed rights were based on fraudulent boundary descriptions. He had needed someone with legitimate credentials to conduct that survey, someone whose findings would be recognized by the courts. He had found Rebecca. What Rebecca had not understood, when she took the assignment, was that the map Fisk had given her, the one with the red marks, was a document that the company had been trying to locate for over a year. It was a company internal map that showed not just the water claims as officially recorded, but the actual intended boundaries of a proposed mass seizure of private land that the company planned to execute once it had achieved sufficient legal cover. Someone inside the company had leaked it. And the person who had leaked it was Rebecca's older brother, James Chandler, who had worked as a surveyor for Southwest Consolidated for 2 years before disappearing 3 months ago. She had not told Howard Fisk about James. She was not sure whether Fisk even knew who had leaked the map. She had taken the assignment because she needed the pay, yes, but also because finding that map had been the first real indication she had received in 3 months that her brother was still alive, and that he had known something worth leaking before he disappeared. She had come to Dusty Creek to find her brother. She had come claiming to be a surveyor. She was a surveyor, but that was not all she was. On the 4th day, she found the first evidence that James had been in Dusty Creek. She found it in an unlikely place, the storeroom of the Red Meridian Saloon, where the bartender, a Mexican man named Eduardo who had been running the place since before the town was incorporated, kept a lost property shelf with items left behind by travelers. Among the items on that shelf was a survey notebook, standard issue, with a government registration stamp on the inside cover and the initials JC written in the corner of the first page. She had not shown it to anyone. She had slipped it into her satchel when Eduardo was occupied with a customer and carried it back to her room and read it in the lamplight and felt the specific and particular terror of finding the handwriting of someone you love in a place that tells you they were there and a context that tells you they were in trouble. James's notes were in code. Not a complex code. He had not had time or resources for complexity, but a substitution cipher that he and Rebecca had used as children to pass notes in their father's house in Philadelphia, because their father had been a strict and humorless man who read his children's correspondence and used whatever he found against them. The cipher was the only secret they had shared with perfect safety. The notes described a meeting, a man named Graves, a location described as the old Spanish adit, which Tom Hargrove had mentioned in passing as an abandoned silver mine shaft about 8 miles north of town, a date 3 months ago, which matched almost exactly the date James had stopped communicating. She had lain awake for a long time that night. On the 5th day, she had gone to the area around the old Spanish adit under the pretense of checking a survey marker she claimed was in that vicinity. Tom had ridden with her. She had found the marker. She had also found, beneath a loose stone near the base of a juniper tree, a second notebook, this one containing a partial affidavit in James's handwriting detailing the fraudulent boundary claims and naming specific individuals within Southwest Consolidated who had authorized them. The affidavit was incomplete. It ended mid-sentence. She had found a torn piece of cloth caught on the thorns of a nearby chaparral bush. The cloth was the same blue-gray as the survey shirt she had sent her brother for his birthday 2 years ago. And then Tom had called to her from his horse, and she had put the notebook in her satchel and walked back as if nothing had happened. That night she had sat in her room and understood for the first time that she was not just looking for her brother. She was in the middle of something that was larger and more dangerous than Howard Fisk had represented to her, and that the hidden motive she had carried into this territory was now tangled up with forces that would not respond well to exposure. She had thought about Clement Whitfield. She had eaten dinner with him 3 times over the course of the week, because Mrs. Aldecoa had a table that seated 8, and Clement took his evening meals there when he was not on a case that kept him out of town, and they had found themselves seated across from each other, with the predictable frequency of two people whose daily paths naturally converged in a town of 600 people. She had observed him carefully. She was good at observation. It was a professional habit, and what she had observed was a man of considerable intelligence and considerable restraint, who held his conclusions privately until he was certain, who listened more than he spoke, and who looked at her sometimes across the dinner table with an expression that she had classified initially as suspicion and had subsequently reclassified as something more complicated. She had also noticed, on the second evening, that he had deliberately steered a conversation about land survey law toward the topic of adverse possession and fraudulent boundary claims, and had watched her face very carefully while he did it. She had given him nothing. She hoped. On the sixth morning she had made her decision. She had been going back and forth about whether to tell Clement Whitfield the truth, or some version of it, or whether to continue the deception until she had what she needed and could leave the territory. The deciding factor had been the torn piece of cloth and the incomplete affidavit and the particular quality of her fear, which had graduated overnight from worried to terrified. She needed an ally. She needed someone who knew this county and its people and its secrets. She needed someone she could trust. And then fate had removed the decision from her hands, because she had come to his office that morning to return the map she had borrowed from his files. She had asked to see the county's official land records the day before, and he had produced a survey map that turned out to be, when she spread it next to the company map from Howard Fisk, an exact match in all the ways that mattered. And she had walked in carrying both maps, and he had seen the company map, and the gun had come out. Now they stood in his office with the gun back in its holster, and the maps on the desk between them, and 6 days of accumulated silence, and hidden motive pressing against the walls. "Name is Rebecca Chandler," she said. "The letter is real, the survey is real. I'm a genuine licensed surveyor contracted by the General Land Office." She paused. "But I am also looking for my brother." Clement Whitfield sat down slowly in his chair. He folded his hands on the desk. "James Chandler," he said. The name hit her like a physical blow. "You know him." "I know of him. He was a surveyor for Southwest Consolidated until 3 months ago." Clement's eyes were steady on her face. "He came to me. He sat in that chair where you're standing and told me he had documentation of fraud. I told him to get me the documentation and I would go to the federal marshal." He stopped, and Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. "He left that evening and never came back." The room was absolutely still. "He's not dead," Clement said, and the care with which he chose those words told her that he had reasons for believing it and also reasons for uncertainty. "I would have found a body. I have found no body, but I do not know where he is." Rebecca sat down in the wooden chair facing his desk because her legs had simply stopped cooperating. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed deliberately. "Tell me everything," she said. Clement Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. And then, apparently reaching some internal decision, he stood up and went to the cabinet beside the window and took out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses, which was not something he did casually, and set them on the desk. "It is going to take some time," he said. "I have time," she said. He poured. He sat down. He began. What he told her took an hour. It was not a simple story. Southwest Consolidated Land and Resources Company had been operating in the territory since 1874 and had presented itself as a legitimate mining and land development enterprise backed by investors in St. Louis and New York. The investors were real. The company's early mining operations had been legitimate. But somewhere around 1876, the company had identified the water rights along the Chandler Creek watershed as the key to controlling grazing access across a vast stretch of territory, and it had begun a systematic and quietly illegal campaign to acquire those rights through a combination of fraudulent land descriptions, forged signatures on transfer documents, and the targeted harassment of small landholders who refused to sell. Clement had been building a case for 8 months. He had evidence of 3 fraudulent transfers and a sworn statement from one landholder, an elderly Tejano man named Bernardo Soto, who had been pressured to sign away his water rights at gunpoint. He had filed a request for a federal marshal and been told the marshal was occupied in the Lincoln County situation, which was truthful. The Lincoln County War had consumed considerable federal resources in 1878 and had filed a second request 2 months later and been told a marshal would be dispatched when one became available. James Chandler had come to him with the company map and a partial affidavit. He had promised to complete the affidavit and return with it the following morning. He had not returned. Clement had spent the weeks after James's disappearance trying to find him without alerting the company to the fact that he was looking, because if the company knew he was looking, it would have reason to do something irreversible, and Clement was not a man who acted when the irreversible was still preventable. He had received Rebecca's letter of introduction from the General Land Office. It had come by mail 3 days before she arrived, and he had checked the registration number and found that it matched a second number he had in his files, which was the number on the authorization form James Chandler had filed with the Land Office before joining Southwest Consolidated. Same family, same surname, registered to different individuals. He had known from the moment the letter arrived that this surveyor's visit was not coincidental. He had said nothing. He had wanted to see what she would do and who she was before deciding whether she was an asset or a further complication. "That is a great deal of trust to extend to a stranger," Rebecca said when he finished. "It is," Clement agreed. He looked down at his glass. "I am not generally inclined toward it." There was something under those words that she felt without fully understanding, a suggestion of something difficult in his past, and she filed it away carefully. "The company map you brought in," he said. "Where did you get it?" She told him about Howard Fisk. He listened without interrupting. "Fisk is legitimate," he said when she was done. "He represents 3 of the families who lost their water rights. I have spoken with him." He paused. "He did not tell me he had found the company map. He may not have known its full significance. Or he chose not to share it until he had an independent survey to back it up." Clement's expression suggested he found this logical if somewhat frustrating. Rebecca told him about the notebooks, the cipher, the old Spanish adit, the torn cloth. By the time she finished, Clement Whitfield was no longer looking at her with the complicated expression of a man assessing a potential threat. He was looking at her with the equally complicated expression of a man who has just realized that the person sitting across from him has been carrying something almost unbearably heavy, alone, for a long time. "I will take you out to the adit this afternoon," he said, "before anyone else has reason to go out there." "You believe me," she said. It came out with more surprise in it than she intended. "I believed you were not what you claimed," he said. "That does not mean I doubted you were honest. The two things are separate." She stared at him. "You are an unusual man, Sheriff Whitfield," she said. A very small thing happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the suggestion of one, and it lasted only a fraction of a second, but she saw it, and it went somewhere inside her that she was not prepared for it to go. They rode out to the adit at 2 in the afternoon. They rode separately at first, Clement on a dark bay gelding named Tom had told her once, Meridian, and Rebecca on the horse she had been renting from the livery stable, a gray mare that had a tendency to drift leftward on uncertain ground. The sun in New Mexico in October was still fierce but beginning to carry the crispness of autumn at altitude, and the light on the red rock was extraordinary, and she found herself looking at the landscape with a purely aesthetic attention that she had not had space for all week. Clement rode with the particular ease of a man who had spent half his life in the saddle, and he did not speak very much, which she was finding she appreciated enormously. They reached the adit area by 4 o'clock. The entrance to the old mine shaft was sealed with timber bracing that had partially collapsed over decades of disuse. The juniper tree was where she had described it. The loose stone was there. Clement examined the space under the stone carefully after she showed him where the notebook had been. "Something else here," he said, and reached in further than she had and drew out, very carefully, a small glass vial stoppered with cork in which there was a folded piece of paper. He looked at her. She shook her head. She had not seen that. He worked the cork out and extracted the paper with careful fingers and unfolded it. It was a map. Hand-drawn, in pencil, on a piece of paper torn from a survey notebook. It showed a location she did not recognize, with what appeared to be compass bearings from two landmarks, the old mine shaft, and something else marked only with a symbol she could not read. Clement could read it. "That is the symbol for the Soto land grant boundary stone," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "This is a location on Bernardo Soto's property." She looked at him. "James left this." "Your brother," he said, "was more thorough than I gave him credit for." And then, after a pause, "and he trusted that someone would come looking." The weight of that James had believed someone would come, had planned for it, had left a trail precisely calibrated for someone who loved him enough to follow it, hit Rebecca without warning, and she turned away quickly, looking out at the canyon rather than letting Clement Whitfield see her face, because she could hold nearly everything but that. She heard him step up beside her. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling afternoon air, and that was enough. It was more than enough. She breathed through it and got herself back. "We cannot go to Soto's property tonight," Clement said eventually. "It will be dark before we get there, and dark country to ride. Tomorrow morning early." She nodded. They rode back in the soft copper light of the setting sun, and this time they rode closer together, not by deliberate intent but because the trail narrowed and the inclination toward proximity, which had been growing quietly all week, was now no longer being actively suppressed by either of them. "How long have you been a surveyor?" Clement asked at some point. It was a safe question. She understood that he was choosing safe questions deliberately. 3 years in practice. Before that, 2 years of study under Henry Carruthers in Denver. Before that, I was a school teacher in Philadelphia. She paused. "I came west after my mother died. My father was already gone. James was already out here. I could not see a reason to stay." "What did you teach?" "Mathematics, geometry, measurement." She almost smiled. Perhaps it was always going to come to this. "Perhaps," he said, a silence. "What brought you to the Rangers?" she asked. It was a bolder question, and she knew it. "The war," he said simply. He had been 14 when the war ended. That meant he had grown up in its shadow and chosen a weapon-bearing life in its aftermath, which told her a number of things. "What took you out of the Rangers?" A longer silence. She thought he might not answer. "A forced choice," he said finally. "Between following orders and following my conscience. I chose my conscience. The Rangers chose otherwise." He did not elaborate and she did not press, but the phrase sat in her mind. Forced choice. Dark past. These were the outlines of a story she did not yet know, and she found herself wanting very much to know it. At dinner that evening, Mrs. Aldecoa had made a lamb stew with dried chilies, and the whole table ate it together. Mrs. Aldecoa, her teenage daughter Lucia, a traveling dry goods merchant named Collins, and Rebecca and Clement. The conversation was general and easy, and Rebecca watched Clement Whitfield be kind to Lucia without performing it, answer Collins's questions about the county without giving more information than was necessary, and drink his coffee with both hands around the cup in a gesture that struck her as quietly revealing, a man who had spent a great deal of time cold. She slept better than she had in a week, which surprised her. They rode out for Bernardo Soto's property before sunrise. Clement had brought a lantern for the dark stretches of trail, and they rode by lamplight through the early morning until the sky began to gray and then pink, and then flood with that particular New Mexico gold that made everything look like it was being seen through amber. Bernardo Soto met them at his gate. He was an old man in his 70s, with white hair and the patient and watchful eyes of someone who had lived long enough to know that strangers at dawn came for a reason. Clement spoke to him in Spanish first, quick and respectful, and Rebecca followed enough of it to understand that he was telling Soto they were not there about the water rights. Not officially. Not yet. Soto listened, looked at Rebecca, and then made a gesture that invited them in. They found the location marked on James's map at the base of the old boundary stone, a smooth river stone the size of a man's head that had been set into the ground probably before anyone currently living had been born, to mark the original Soto land grant boundary. Someone had disturbed the earth around it recently. Clement dug with a small folding spade, while Rebecca held the compass and Soto watched from a polite distance with his arms folded. What they found was a tin tobacco box, sealed with a strip of leather wound around it. Inside the box were three things: the completed affidavit in James's handwriting, a second affidavit signed by someone named Ruiz, which was a name Clement recognized as a former company employee, and a letter. The letter was addressed in James's handwriting to Rebecca Chandler, General Land Office, Washington, D.C. Clement handed it to her without opening it. She read it standing at the old boundary stone, with the morning light coming up golden and the smell of sage and dry earth around her, and the sound of a quail calling from somewhere in the brush. The letter told her that James was alive and in hiding. It told her he was staying with a Navajo family he knew from survey work in the Northern Territory, and that he would stay there until the affidavits reached federal hands. It told her that the man named Graves, the one mentioned in the cipher notes, was a company enforcer who had come to the adit the night James left, and that James had gotten away but barely, and that he had not gone back to Clement Whitfield's office because he feared the company had ears inside the town. It told her he loved her, and that he was sorry to have put her in this position, and that he had not meant for her to come, but was not surprised that she had. And then in the last line of the letter, in the teasing voice of an older brother who had known her all her life, he had written, "Find someone you can trust, Becky. In my experience, they are rare out here, but they exist. Pay attention." She folded the letter. She was not going to cry in front of Clement Whitfield in a field at sunrise. She was absolutely not going to do that. She turned around and found him standing 3 feet away watching her face, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him, which meant she had no defenses against it. "He is safe," she said. Her voice held. "Good," Clement said. And that one word, said in that particular way, felt like a great deal more than one word. He took the affidavits. He handled them like documents he knew the value of, which he did because he had been waiting for them for months. He explained to Bernardo Soto in Spanish and then translated for Rebecca what the affidavits contained and what he intended to do with them. So, listened, nodded, and said something that Clement translated as, "It is about time." They rode back to Dusty Creek, and Clement sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office in Albuquerque from the telegraph office, and then made a second trip to the telegraph office alone, which Rebecca noticed from the window of the general store where she was buying provisions, and she wondered what the second telegram was and to whom it was sent. She was not going to ask. She was going to trust him. That was a new sensation. The federal marshal arrived 3 days later. His name was Thomas Vickers, and he was a compact, weathered man in his late 40s who smelled of trail dust and looked like he had been awake for 48 hours, which he probably had, given the distance from Albuquerque. He read the affidavits. He examined the company map. He interviewed Bernardo Soto with Clement translating. He interviewed Rebecca about the map and its provenance, and she told him about Howard Fisk and about her brother, and he took notes without any visible emotional reaction to anything she said. At the end of 2 days of intensive work, Marshal Vickers issued warrants for the arrest of 4 individuals associated with Southwest Consolidated Land and Resources Company, including the man named Graves, whose full name was Arthur Graves, and who was, as it turned out, not a company employee in any official sense, but had been operating in the territory as a hired agent of enforcement under a series of assumed identities. He had a warrant outstanding in Colorado already. The arrests were made without drama. Clement executed them with Tom Hargrove's help and the presence of Marshal Vickers, and none of the four individuals chose to resist in any meaningful way, which Clement had predicted based on the particular cowardice that characterized men who did their damage through paperwork and hired violence rather than direct confrontation. Arthur Graves was found at a drinking establishment 12 miles east of Dusty Creek. When Clement put the handcuffs on him, Graves said something that Rebecca, standing nearby, was close enough to hear. He said, "The Chandler girl has been more trouble than she is worth." Clement Whitfield had an expression that Rebecca had come to recognize as his neutral face, the one he wore when he was feeling something strongly and had decided to feel it without acting on it. He wore that expression for approximately 2 seconds. Then he said, "Mind your step going to the horse," and put his hand on Graves's shoulder in a way that was technically handling a prisoner, but conveyed something more personal. She looked at the back of his head and felt something warm and complicated move through her. James came in on the stage from the north 4 days after the arrests, thin and bearded, and with the particular alertness of a man who had been in hiding long enough to become reflexively watchful, and Rebecca was standing outside the stage stop when the door opened and he climbed down, and she walked forward and he looked at her and they stood for a moment in the street, and then she put her arms around him and held on. She heard him say, quietly over her shoulder, "I am sorry, Becky." She said, "Shut up, James," he laughed. It was a ragged, relieved sound. She pulled back and looked at his face and checked it the way she always had, the way older siblings and younger siblings develop their own private systems of communication, and what she read there was exhaustion and relief, and the gradual loosening of something that had been held very tight for a long time. Then he looked past her shoulder, and his expression changed to something wary. She turned. Clement was standing on the boardwalk outside his office, which was across and down the street from the stage stop. He had his arms crossed and was watching. "Is that Whitfield?" James said. "Yes, he helped you." "He did." James was quiet for a moment. "He is a good man," he said, with the weight of someone who had spent time trying to figure that out from a distance. "I was afraid to trust him at first. I should not have been." Rebecca said nothing. She was looking at Clement Whitfield and he was looking at her, and the distance between them felt very particular. That evening, there was a gathering at Mrs. Aldecoa's table that extended to the parlor, because Marshall Vickers was still in town, and Bernardo Soto had come in with his daughter and her husband, and Tom Hargrove had brought his wife, a cheerful and outspoken woman named Clara who had opinions about everything and no hesitation in expressing them. Mrs. Aldecoa produced an extraordinary amount of food, and there was a bottle of good whiskey from the Red Meridian, and the evening had the quality of a held breath being finally released. James sat beside Rebecca and talked with Marshall Vickers about the affidavits and what would happen next. There would be a territorial court case, a significant one, that would likely take months, and James would need to be available as a witness, which meant he would need to remain in the territory for the foreseeable future. Vickers spoke to Bernardo Soto and his family about the process of restoring the water rights, which was going to require additional legal work and time, but which Vickers was prepared to initiate officially before he left. Rebecca sat at that table in the lamplight and felt, for the first time in months, that the ground under her feet was solid. She looked across the table at Clement Whitfield, who was listening to something Clara Hargrove was saying with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who has been addressed very energetically by someone he had not expected to be energetic, and she felt a smile start at the corner of her mouth that she could not stop. He caught her looking. He raised an eyebrow, which was a gesture she had come to recognize as his particular form of dry humor. She pressed her lips together against the smile. He looked away, but she saw the corner of his own mouth do the thing it did. Later, when people were beginning to drift toward home or toward the saloon or toward bed, and the parlor had emptied out to just the two of them, and the remains of the evening on the table, Rebecca stood and began to gather cups and Clement stood and began to help, and they worked in the domestic companionableness of people who were not thinking about what they were doing but were very conscious of each other. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I have a survey to finish," she said. "Officially, the land office work is still incomplete, another 2 weeks probably. After that." She set down the cup she was holding and thought about that. After that had not been a concept she had allowed herself very much. After that had been the invisible country on the other side of what she needed to do. "I am not certain," she said honestly. He was quiet, moving cups. "Then, Denver, I suppose, that is where your work is." "That is where my work was," she said. "It does not have to be where my work is." A pause that lasted long enough to say something without words. "The land office is expanding its operations in the territory," he said. "There is considerable demand for survey work in New Mexico, the county specifically. The water rights dispute has made clear that there are a significant number of parcels with disputed or incomplete survey records." She turned and looked at him directly. He was looking at the far wall in a manner that was almost absurdly deliberate. "That sounds like useful work," she said carefully. "It would be." He finally looked at her. There was something in his eyes that was very direct and also very careful, as if he was offering something and watching to see if it was wanted. "It would be work that would keep a surveyor in the county for some time, possibly a considerable time." "I see," she said. "I'm not making a very direct statement," he said with a slight air of self-reproach. "I am aware of that." "You are making a very Clement Whitfield sort of statement," she said. "I have had some experience with them." That did produce a full smile. It was brief, but it was real, and it changed his face in a way that she filed away in the place where she kept things she did not want to lose. "What I am attempting to say," he said, "is that I would not be unhappy if you stayed." "No," she agreed. "Neither would I." They stood in Mrs. Aldecoa's parlor in the amber lamplight of a late October evening in 1878, with the desert outside gone cool and quiet, and the distant sound of the Red Meridian's piano carrying faintly on the air. And the thing between them that had been gathering and resisted and complicated and impossible all week was simply and suddenly present. He stepped toward her and then stopped, which was him being careful, and she appreciated the care but was tired of the distance. And so she stepped the remaining distance herself and looked up at his face, and he looked down at hers, and then he kissed her, which was quiet and unhurried and certain in the way that things are certain when they have been building for a long time. She kissed him back. She put her hands against his chest and felt his arms come around her and thought, with the entirely calm and lucid portion of her mind that never quite switched off, that she had not felt safe like this in a very long time, that she had not expected to. They stood like that in the lamplight for a while. When they separated, she rested her forehead briefly against his jaw and felt his breath slow and steady. 2 weeks, he said, meaning the survey. 2 weeks, she agreed. And then we will discuss this more directly. We will, she said. She stepped back. Her face was warm. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the warmth between them was enormous and quiet. She went upstairs to her room and lay in the dark for a long time, not sleeping, looking at the ceiling and thinking about forced choices and dark pasts, and the unexpected geography of what came after the thing you came for was done. The next 2 weeks were some of the most extraordinary of her life, and also the most ordinary. She worked every day, out in the field with her transit and her notebook, and now, a proper survey crew of 2 local men that Clement had arranged through Tom Hargrove, men who knew the land and who treated her with a combination of initial uncertainty and rapidly growing respect, as it became clear that she knew what she was doing. The survey work was genuinely interesting. The watershed was more complex than the original 1874 record suggested, and she found 3 cases of significantly displaced survey posts that she could only explain as the result of deliberate alteration, which she documented meticulously and noted in her official report as evidence of intentional record manipulation. She ate dinner at Mrs. Aldecoa's table most evenings. Clement ate dinner there most evenings. James, who had taken a room in the boarding house as well, ate dinner there sometimes, and watched the two of them with an expression of fond and barely concealed amusement that Rebecca pointedly ignored. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, she and Clement began the gradual and delightful business of knowing each other. She learned that he had been born in Tennessee and had come west at 17 with nothing but his horse and his determination. She learned that he had served with the Rangers from age 22 to 31, and that the forced choice that had ended that service had been a situation in which he had been ordered to arrest a group of Tejano farmers who had resisted being moved from land they had held legally for 2 generations, and he had refused and walked away and been blacklisted from official service in Texas for 3 years before coming to New Mexico. She learned that he had a sister in Albuquerque named Grace whom he visited when he could and wrote to regularly. She learned that he could cook 3 things and cook them extremely well: salt pork, cornbread, and a bean stew with dried peppers that he had learned from Bernardo Soto. She told him about Philadelphia and her father and the particular suffocating quality of that life. She told him about coming west and the experience of the western sky, the first time she had stood on a mesa in Colorado and understood scale in a way that she had not understood it before, as something physical and not merely mathematical. She told him about her students in Denver and the particular satisfaction of watching a 10-year-old understand geometry for the first time. She told him about the years of study under Henry Carruthers and the ways the land spoke to her through measurement, how a survey was never just a set of numbers but a story about where things were and what they were worth and who had laid claim to them. He listened in the way he did everything completely, without interruption, with his eyes on her face. One evening they walked together to the edge of town where the land opened out toward the mesa and stood in the early November dark watching the stars, which in New Mexico were extraordinary, and she told him the names of constellations, and he told her which of them were used for navigation, and they stood side by side looking up at the sky that went on forever, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was what she wanted, not as a vague future desire but as a specific and present fact. She told him so, not in those exact words but close enough. She said she had been thinking about the county surveyor position and whether the territorial government would establish one, because based on her survey work it was clear the county needed a permanent professional presence and she was qualified for the position and interested in it. Clement was quiet for a moment. "Is that entirely about the position?" he asked. She looked at the stars. "No," she said. He turned to look at her. "Good," he said. And then he said nothing else and she laughed, which she was not entirely expecting, and he looked at her laugh with the expression she had come to love most on his face, which was the one where he was not performing anything but simply experiencing what was in front of him. He took her hand. She let him. They walked back to town in the dark with their hands linked and the stars overhead and the distant glow of the town's lamps ahead of them. And Rebecca Chandler thought that her brother was alive, and the case was solved, and the land would be restored, and she was holding hands with a man who was the most genuinely good person she had met in recent memory. And that the world was not what it had seemed 6 weeks ago when she had boarded a stage in Santa Fe with a secret and a satchel and a fear she had been carrying alone. The survey was completed on the 14th day. She submitted her official report to the land office by mail and delivered a copy in person to Marshal Vickers, who had remained in the territory pending the beginning of the legal proceedings against Southwest Consolidated. The report was 92 pages and included 18 detailed exhibits and was, in the opinion of every person who read it, excellent work. Vickers told her so. He also told her that her documentation of the displaced survey posts had been critical to the case, and that he had no doubt the territorial courts would find it compelling. James told her, in the way of brothers, that he had expected nothing less and was proud of her, and would have said so from the beginning except that she would have been insufferable. She hit him in the shoulder. He laughed. Howard Fisk rode out from Santa Fe to review the report, and met with Clement and Marshal Vickers and Rebecca and James together in the sheriff's office, a gathering that lasted most of a day and involved a great deal of coffee and a great deal of careful legal discussion. Fisk was a thin, precise man who seemed to run almost entirely on coffee and professional intensity, and he and Clement had an initial tension between them that stemmed from Clement's earlier frustration about the concealed company map, but which resolved into a professional respect by mid-afternoon, when it became clear that Fisk had not known the full significance of the map, and had not concealed it from any intent to harm the case, but simply from an attorney's instinct to protect his evidence. It was an important meeting, because by the end of it they had agreed on the overall legal strategy for restoring the water rights to the affected landholders, and the strategy was sound. The case would go to the territorial court in Santa Fe in the spring. The affidavits from James and Ruiz, combined with Rebecca's survey documentation, constituted a case that Fisk was confident about. James would testify. He had accepted that weeks ago. Rebecca would provide expert witness testimony about the survey findings. Clement would provide the chain of evidence documentation and his 8 months of investigative work. Bernardo Soto and the other affected landholders would have their day in court. After the meeting, as Fisk rode back toward Santa Fe and the marshal returned to his temporary office in the Telegraph Building, Rebecca walked to the edge of the small porch outside the sheriff's office and stood in the afternoon sun, and she felt the case closing around her like a story reaching its final chapters. Everything she had come for was resolved. Her brother was safe. The evidence was secured. The legal process was in motion. The water rights would be restored. She had nothing to go back to Denver for. She had not had anything to go back to Denver for since approximately the 3rd evening at Mrs. Aldecoa's dinner table, but she was only fully acknowledging it now. Clement came out and stood beside her. She said, "I am going to write to the Territorial Land Office about the county surveyor position." He said, "I know." She looked at him. "Did you have something to do with that?" He looked faintly caught. "I may have mentioned to the land commissioner in Santa Fe when I telegraphed him about the case that the county's survey records were in a state that warranted a permanent professional position." She stared at him. "That second telegram," she said. "The one you sent from the telegraph office the morning after the first warrant." He looked at the horizon. "Possibly. Clement Whitfield," she said. He turned and looked at her with his gray eyes and the particular expression of a man who has done something deliberate and is not apologizing for it, but is somewhat uncertain of the reception. She kissed him on the porch of the sheriff's office in the middle of the afternoon, with anyone in Dusty Creek who happened to be looking their direction fully able to see. Tom Hargrove, who was crossing the street on the other side, said something that she could not hear, but that made Clement, when they separated, press the back of his hand briefly to his mouth to contain a response. "Was that Tom?" she asked. "Yes," Clement said. "What did he say?" "Something I will tell you later," he said, and there was something in his expression that she was going to have to get used to, the way he could be funny without trying to be. The way his reserve cracked into warmth in moments that he did not plan. James left for Albuquerque in November to wait out the winter near the federal marshal's office, where he could be easily reached when the court proceedings began in spring. He had, in the weeks in Dusty Creek, acquired the rudiments of a plan for his life post-crisis. He had been offered a position by a survey firm in Albuquerque and intended to take it, on the condition that it would allow him to remain available for the legal proceedings. He was also, Rebecca noted with sisterly satisfaction, spending a great deal of time in correspondence with a woman he had mentioned as the daughter of the Navajo family who had sheltered him, a woman named Ayana, and his expression when he wrote those letters was an expression Rebecca recognized because it was one she had been wearing herself for 3 weeks. She saw him off at the stage stop. "You are staying," he said. It was not a question. "I am staying," she said. He looked at her with the fullness of their shared history, everything they had been through together and separately, The father and the mother and the Philadelphia house and the move west and the years apart and the fear of these past months and the resolution of it. And he said, "I am glad." She hugged him again, harder this time because she could. "Write to me," she said. "I always do," he said, which was true, even when the letters took months to arrive and found her in places he had not expected. The stage took him away in a cloud of dust, and she stood watching it go and felt the particular bittersweet quality of a parting with someone you know is safe, which is entirely different from a parting when you do not know. November in Dusty Creek was cold and bright and extremely productive. Rebecca established a working office in a room above the general store that she rented for a modest sum, and she began the systematic work of reviewing all the county's land records, which were in precisely the state of disarray that Clement had suggested they were, and she threw herself into it with the focus she gave to everything that mattered to her. Clement rode out of town for several days at the end of November in connection with an unrelated matter, a cattle theft dispute in the northern part of the county, and she found, in his absence, that the town felt smaller and quieter, and that she was more aware than she had previously been of the specific time at which he usually came through the general store for his morning supplies, and the specific hour at which he appeared at Mrs. Aldecoa's table in the evening. When he came back on a Thursday afternoon, she was at her work table above the store with her surveying instruments spread around her and the county records in stacks around that, and she heard his horse in the street below and stood up and went to the window and watched him dismount and speak to Tom and hand over the reins, and she stood at that window for probably longer than was strictly necessary. He looked up. She lifted a hand from the window glass. He lifted a hand from the street. It was extremely undramatic, and she found it entirely adequate. They had Christmas at Mrs. Aldecoa's house, along with Tom and Clara Hargrove and Bernardo Soto and his daughter and her family and Eduardo from the saloon, and a collection of other people who lived in or around Dusty Creek and who were connected to Mrs. Aldecoa in the way that people in small towns are connected to the woman who runs the boarding house, which is to say by proximity and food and the accumulated small kindnesses of years. There was a lot of food. There was music, because Clara Hargrove played the guitar with considerable skill, and Eduardo turned out to have a fine baritone voice, and Lucia Aldecoa could sing harmony, and the parlor was full of lamplight and sound, and the specific warmth of people who have been through something together. Rebecca sat beside Clement and felt his arm settle around her shoulders at some point in the evening, and leaned into it, and thought about Philadelphia Christmases that had been cold in a different way, and felt something she could only describe as arriving. Not the word she had expected for this feeling, but the right one. She had been arriving all year. She had been arriving since she got off the stage in October with her satchel and her hidden motives and her fear, and she was here now, and this was the place. He turned to look at her at some point during the music, and she turned to look at him, and what passed between them was something quiet and enormous. In January, the Territorial Land Commissioner formally established the position of County Surveyor for Socorro County and appointed Rebecca Chandler to it, which was announced in the Socorro County Gazette with a paragraph that was both factual and subtly impressed. She was the first woman to hold a county-level government position in the territory, which the Gazette mentioned in passing, and which Rebecca herself found less interesting than the work. In February, Clement asked her to marry him. He did it very simply, which was entirely consistent with him. They were riding back from an inspection of a newly disputed boundary marker in the eastern part of the county. She had brought him along because it was in a difficult stretch of terrain, and she had wanted someone who knew the land, and also because she had been finding reasons to bring him with her whenever possible, which was a habit she intended to continue indefinitely. And they had dismounted to check the marker on foot, and she had been crouching with her compass, and he had been standing nearby with the horses, and she had looked up and said something about the marker position, and he had said, in the same conversational tone, "I would like to ask you something." She had looked at him. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not with the rising inflection of a question, but with the calm certainty of a man asking something he has thought about for a long time and has decided is right. She sat back on her heels in the New Mexico dirt with her compass in her hand, and looked up at Clement Whitfield and thought about betrayal and hidden motives and dark pasts, and the particular impossibility of trust in the wild country, and the way those things could be not simply overcome, but transformed into something else, into something that required them to have happened in order to be what it was. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." Something moved across his face that was close to happiness, the real and unguarded kind. He helped her up. He held her hand longer than was necessary to help her up. They rode back to town in the low February sun, and she looked at the landscape around her, the red rock and the sage and the enormous sky, and thought about measurement, about how some things could be precisely quantified, and some things absolutely could not, and how the ones that could not were the more interesting category. They were married in March in the church that also served as the schoolhouse, because the minister used both buildings and seemed to find no incongruity in this, and the ceremony was attended by what seemed to be the entire county. Mrs. Aldecoa cried in the happy and genuine way of a woman who had watched them eat dinner across from each other for months and had known before they did. Tom Hargrove wore his best suit and grinned the entire time. Clara Hargrove played a hymn on the guitar. Bernardo Soto sat in the front row as an honored guest, because Clement had asked him to, and he sat with his daughter's family and watched with the dignified approval of a man who had been through enough to know the value of a good day. James came from Albuquerque on the stage. He arrived the evening before the wedding looking tired and sunburned and considerably happier than he had been, and he had brought Ayanna with him, which Rebecca had not known to expect, and Ayanna was extraordinarily precise and self-possessed and quiet in the way that read as strength, and she looked at James when she thought he was not watching with an expression that made Rebecca's chest ache with recognition. She introduced Ayanna to Clement and watched them evaluate each other with mutual careful respect, and then she looked at her brother and said quietly, "I like her very much." James said, equally quietly, "I know you would." The ceremony was simple and sincere. The minister read from Scripture and from a selection of texts that Clement had chosen himself and that Rebecca had found moving, about the building of trust and the choosing of trust as an act of will in difficult country. Clement's vows were plain and direct, and entirely his own. Rebecca's vows mentioned measurement because that was who she was, and she measured what they had found against what she had expected, and the difference was extraordinary. He slid the ring on her finger. It was a simple gold band. She had not asked for anything else, and he had not offered anything else, and it was perfect. They kissed, and Tom Hargrove made the sound he had made on the porch outside the sheriff's office in October, and this time Rebecca heard it clearly, and it was an extremely sincere and cheerful expression of approval, and she laughed against Clement's mouth, which made him pull back and look at her with the full and unguarded happiness that she was still getting used to, still learning to receive without turning away from it. The celebration went on well into the night. Eduardo had brought whiskey from the Red Meridian. Mrs. Aldecoa had made enough food for the entire county. There was dancing, because Clara had recruited 2 other musicians, a fiddle player from the livery stable, and a man who played harmonica who nobody seemed to know very well but who played beautifully. And the schoolhouse floor was cleared, and people danced who had not danced in years. Clement danced with her, which she had not expected, because nothing about him particularly suggested dancing, but he was steady and sure-footed, and he held her with the same quality of presence that he brought to everything. And she danced with him in the lamplight with the fiddle going, and the sound of people who were happy around them, and the night outside full of stars. And she thought that she would remember this exact physical sensation for the rest of her life. James and Ayanna danced together with the slightly careful joy of people who are figuring each other out in public, and it was beautiful to watch. Late in the evening, when the music had slowed and the crowd had thinned, Clement led her outside and they stood in the cool March night, her hand in his, and looked up at the stars. "Orion," she said, pointing. "You can see him clearly tonight." "Navigation star," he said. "Due south if you know how to read him." "Always finding your way," she said. He looked at her. "I believe I have found it," he said. She stood on her toes and kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the cold night was nothing because they were warm. Spring came, and with it, the court proceedings in Santa Fe. Rebecca and Clement and James all traveled to Santa Fe for the trial, which lasted 12 days and was covered by newspapers as far away as St. Louis, because the case of Southwest Consolidated Land and Resources Company versus the territory of New Mexico and the affected landholders was a significant and precedent-setting matter. The legal team Fisk had assembled was thorough. The affidavits from James and Ruiz were admitted as evidence. Rebecca's survey report was submitted as expert evidence, and she testified for 2 days under questioning, and the opposing counsel's attempts to undermine her expertise were met with the particular and polite devastation of a woman who knew her subject better than almost anyone and had the patience to demonstrate it. Clement's investigative documentation was admitted, and he testified about the chain of evidence with the calm precision of someone who had kept meticulous records for 8 months specifically against this day. Bernardo Soto testified through an interpreter and was the most powerful witness of all because he was old and dignified, and he told the truth about what had been done to him and to his family's land, and the court was very quiet while he spoke. The verdict came back in favor of the territory and the landholders. Southwest Consolidated Land and Resources Company was found to have committed systematic fraud, and its water rights in Socorro County were declared void. The 4 arrested individuals were convicted of various charges. Arthur Graves received the most severe sentence. The company's assets in the territory were to be liquidated, and a portion of the proceeds returned to the affected landholders as restitution. Bernardo Soto's water rights were restored. The other affected landholders' rights were restored. The land was returned in the sense that it could be returned. The years of the wrong could not be undone, but the legal wrong was corrected, and that mattered. James shook Clement's hand on the steps of the Santa Fe courthouse, and then, uncharacteristically, pulled him into a brief embrace, which made Clement look slightly startled and then pleased. They had a celebratory dinner that evening with Fisk and Vickers and James and Ayanna, and the conversation was high and relieved and shot through with the particular energy of a long-held tension finally released. Walking back to the hotel through Santa Fe's old streets, Rebecca tucked her arm through Clement's and leaned against him. "It is done," she said. "The legal part," he said. "The restoration will take time. Some of those landholders will struggle. The damage runs deep." "Yes," she said. "But it will not run unchallenged anymore." She paused. "And the survey records will be accurate from now on." He pressed his arm against hers in acknowledgement. "Is that why you took the county position? To make sure the records were accurate?" "Partly," she said, "and partly because of what my brother told me." "What did he tell you?" "He said to find someone I could trust." She looked up at Clement's profile against the Santa Fe night sky. "I did." He looked down at her. His expression in the lamplight was open and certain in hers. "You did," he agreed. They came home to Dusty Creek in May. The town had not changed while they were gone, as towns generally do not over 2 weeks, but it looked different to her the way things look different when you have claimed them. The main street with its dust and its boardwalks and its squat adobe buildings and the red Meridian's hanging sign. The church that was also a school. The sheriff's office with its red painted sign. Mrs. Aldecoa's boarding house, though they no longer lived there. Clement had a house on the eastern edge of town that was modest and well-built, and had enough rooms and a kitchen garden that Mrs. Aldecoa had been tending in their absence. Tom Hargrove was in front of the sheriff's office when they rode in, and gave them a report that covered the 2 weeks of their absence in 3 highly compressed minutes. concluding with the information that 2 new families had arrived to settle land on the restored parcels, which was good news, and that the windmill at the Sodo property had finally been repaired, which was news Clement received with evident satisfaction. That first evening home, Rebecca made dinner, which she had been thinking about on the road, a proper meal in the kitchen, in the house that was now theirs. Clement had found the recipe somewhere in his years of batching it, and it was her first time attempting it, and it came out extremely well, and she felt the domestic satisfaction of something well made in a place that was hers. He came in from the stable while she was finishing and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the specific quality of that moment. The house, the smell of food, the evening light, the 2 of them settled into her like something permanent. "Welcome home," he said. "Welcome home," she said. Summer in Dusty Creek was extraordinary. The work was absorbing and good. There were 3 new boundary disputes arising from the land restoration that required fresh surveys, and she tackled each of them with the focused attention of someone who understood that the accuracy of the record was not a bureaucratic matter, but a question of justice. She trained a young local man named Francisco in basic survey technique, because she believed the county should eventually have more than one surveyor, and he proved to be quick and attentive and good with the instruments. Clement was dealing with the normal complex flow of a county that was growing and settling, which produced its own kind of conflict, and he handled it with the patient and principled approach that she had come to understand was simply who he was, not performance, not policy, but character. They had evenings on the porch. They had mornings in the kitchen. They had Sunday rides into the country when the work allowed. They had disagreements, because 2 sharp-minded people with strong views will disagree, and they had the particular experience of working through disagreements with someone who argued from position rather than emotion and who listened even when they thought you were wrong. She told him one evening about her father, not the version she had told people before, which was factual and spare, but the real version, the full weight of it. He listened without saying anything until she was finished, and then he said, very quietly, that he was sorry, and he meant it in the way that was not a social formula but an actual response to an actual thing. She told him, another evening, about the first time she had stood on the mesa in Colorado and understood scale, and he told her about the first time he had ridden out of Tennessee at 17 with nothing but his horse and understood freedom, and they sat with those 2 stories side by side in the dark, and understood that they were not so different from each other, the 2 of them, in the ways that mattered. In September, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before telling Clement, not from doubt, but from the particular quality of attention she gave to significant information before acting on it. When she told him straight out over breakfast, and watched his face do the thing where it moved through several responses very quickly before settling on the one that was real, which was a happiness so immediate and complete that it was almost startling to see. He stood up from the breakfast table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands and held them, and she looked at his face and felt the happiness move through her too, warm and enormous. "A boy," he said tentatively with the slight self-awareness of someone who knows they are speculating. "Or a girl," she said. "Or a girl," he agreed readily. "We will know when we know," she said. "Yes," he said. He pressed her hands to his mouth briefly. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I intend to continue working." He smiled. "I would not have suggested otherwise." She continued working. She continued surveying boundaries in the field well into November, to Francisco's occasional anxious distraction, because she was perfectly capable and not fragile, and the work was hers. By December she had transitioned to office and records work as a matter of comfort rather than necessity, and she spent the winter months doing the detailed and painstaking work of reviewing the county's complete land records and producing the first fully accurate land record for Socorro County in the territory's history. The baby was born in April. in the blue room at the back of the house, with a doctor and Mrs. Aldecoa present and Clement in the hall outside the door, which he had been told to wait in and had complied with extremely poorly, if the back-and-forth sounds of pacing were any indication. It was a boy. He was born in the April morning, with the light coming through the window over the desert and the sound of everything outside going on as normal, which was both remarkable and entirely appropriate. She heard Clement come in when Mrs. Aldecoa opened the door, and she heard his breath change when he saw the baby, and she turned her head from where she lay to look at him, and he was standing at the foot of the bed looking at the bundle in her arms with an expression that was beyond what she had words for. He came and sat beside her carefully, and she put the baby in his arms and watched Clement Whitfield hold his son for the first time, and the quality of his stillness in that moment was something she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Samuel," she said, "if you agree." He looked at her. His eyes were bright. "Samuel," he said. Samuel James Whitfield, for her brother who was alive, and for the afternoon on the porch, and the wedding in the schoolhouse, and the steps of the Santa Fe courthouse, and every evening on the porch and every morning in the kitchen, for the stories told in the dark and the hands held in the lamplight and the stars named, and the ground measured and trusted and claimed. Tom Hargrove, when he came to see the baby 3 days later, held Samuel very carefully and with enormous seriousness, and announced that he was an excellent baby, which everyone agreed was not the most sophisticated assessment, but was entirely heartfelt. Clara Hargrove brought food, the way Clara brought food to everything significant, and held Samuel and wept with happiness, which she made no effort to conceal. James came the following week. He came from Albuquerque on the stage with Ayanna, and Rebecca stood at the stage stop and watched her brother get off the stage, and Ayanna get off behind him, and she saw, in the way Ayanna's hand found James's hand on the step down, something that told her what she suspected. James held his nephew with the contained wonder of a man encountering something genuinely new. "He looks like you," James told Rebecca. "He looks like Clement," she said. "He looks like both of you," Ayanna said, which was the most accurate observation. James and Ayanna married quietly in Albuquerque the following autumn, which Rebecca and Clement attended, and which was a smaller and simpler gathering than their own wedding had been, but no less full of meaning. Dusty Creek grew, as towns in the New Mexico Territory were growing in the years after the major land conflicts, slowly, and with the particular combination of hope and difficulty that characterized frontier settlement. New families came to the restored land parcels along the watershed. Bernardo Soto's family remained and prospered. The water flowed where it was meant to flow. Rebecca's survey work remained the foundation of it. Every parcel accurately measured and recorded, every boundary clear, the record honest and complete. She trained Francisco thoroughly, and he eventually became her deputy surveyor, and she trained 2 other young people over the following years, because she believed in building something that would outlast her own presence in a way that her Philadelphia schoolteacher self would have recognized as consistent. Clement continued as sheriff, re-elected twice, with an increasing reputation in the territory for the particular quality of justice that balanced law and conscience, something that was rarer than it ought to have been. He continued to correspond with Grace in Albuquerque, and they visited when they could, and Grace, who was warm and direct and possessed of a humor that Rebecca found immediately compatible with her own, became a genuine fixture in their life. Samuel grew up in the house at the eastern edge of Dusty Creek, with the red rock and the sage outside his window, and his mother's instruments on the shelf and his father's guns locked in the cabinet, and the particular knowledge of a child who is entirely loved and whose world, while not without its difficulties, is fundamentally safe. When he was 4, he asked his mother what she was doing with the brass instrument on the tripod in the yard. She told him she was measuring the distance between 2 points. He asked why. She said, "Because you have to know where things are before you can know what they are worth." He thought about this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old considering a large idea. Then he asked if he could look through the eyepiece. She helped him up and let him look, and heard his small intake of breath at what he saw, which was the distant mesa made close and clear. Clement came out of the house at some point in this process, and stood in the yard watching his wife teach their son to use a theodolite. And she glanced at him, and he was wearing the expression she loved best on him, the full and unguarded one, and she thought about everything that had brought her to this yard in this town in this territory. The secret and the hidden motive and the fear and the gun raised and lowered, and the trust extended carefully, and the map on the desk, and the kiss in the parlor, and the morning at the boundary stone, and all the evenings since then. All the accumulated ordinary and extraordinary moments of a life built in a difficult and beautiful place with a man who had known she was not entirely what she claimed and had said nothing and had waited to see who she really was. She had been a surveyor all along. She had measured the distances. She had found the right markers. She had drawn the accurate map. She had found the place where things were worth what they were. In October of 1883, 5 years almost to the month after Rebecca Chandler had stepped off the stage in Dusty Creek with her satchel and her secrets and her theodolite, she and Clement rode out to the edge of the mesa at sunset the way they sometimes did on Sunday evenings, leaving Samuel with Mrs. Aldecoa, who adored him unconditionally and spoiled him with cornbread, and they sat on the mesa rim with their horses behind them and looked out at the country that she had measured and he had protected and they had made their home. The light was extraordinary, the way it always was at this hour in October in New Mexico, amber and rose and deep gold, painting the canyon walls with colors that no pigment had quite captured and probably never would. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "I have been thinking," she said. "That is rarely simple with you," he said. She smiled. "Samuel needs a companion, a beat." "Needs," he said, testing the word. "Strongly benefits from," she amended. He turned his head to look at her and she looked back at him, and between them in the golden light was all of it, the whole accumulated weight and warmth of what they had become to each other, and his expression was quiet and certain and entirely hers. "Then we will see what the next survey finds," he said. She laughed, which she had been doing for 5 years at the things he said, the dry and precise and unexpected humor of him that she loved, that she had been discovering in layers and was still discovering. She reached up and touched his face briefly, the way she sometimes did, not from sentiment but from the genuine and repeated impulse to verify that this was real, that he was here, that they were here, on the mesa at the edge of everything, with the sun going down over the red rock and the stars beginning to appear in the deep blue overhead. He caught her hand against his jaw and held it. "You are real," he said, because after 5 years he had learned to read her perfectly. "I know," she said. "I am still accounting for it." He kissed her temple. She closed her eyes. Below them, Dusty Creek sent up its small lights into the gathering dark. The red Meridian's lamp was on. Mrs. Aldecoa's windows were warm. The sheriff's office stood with its red sign. The church that was also a school. The general store. The telegraph office through which so much had moved, the first telegram, the warrant, the second telegram that had quietly shaped the rest of her life. The survey records in her office were complete and accurate and represented the true lines of the land. Her brother was alive and married and had a daughter of his own now, named Esperanza, which meant hope in Spanish, and James had written in his last letter that the name was Ayana's choice, and it was right. Her husband sat beside her on the mesa rim with the last of the sunlight on his face and his arm around her shoulders, and he was exactly who she had found him to be from the beginning, a man who had seen through a deception and said nothing and waited, and in the waiting had demonstrated a trust that she had spent 5 years proving deserved to have been extended. She had come claiming to be a surveyor. She was a surveyor. She was also now everything else: wife, mother, county officer, neighbor, friend, maker of a life in difficult and beautiful country, keeper of true records in a place that had suffered long enough from false ones. The last of the sun slipped below the mesa and the stars opened up above them, thousands of them, the enormous western sky doing what it always did, making everything both smaller and larger at once. "Orion," she said, as the constellation resolved in the darkening blue. "Due south," he said. "We are already home," she said. "Yes," he said, "we are." She let her head rest against his shoulder and looked at the stars and at the dark land below and at the lights of the town that was theirs, and she thought that this was what the measurements had been for, all along. Not to map the distance between things, but to find the place where the distance was right, where the ground was true, where the things that had been lost or displaced or falsely claimed could be restored to where they belonged. She had come with a secret. She had found a life. The desert night was full of stars, and the man beside her was warm and certain in hers, and everything, finally, completely, was exactly where it was supposed to be.